Uh, the second half of the course, instead of focusing on how we motivate ourselves to reach our goals or to become expert, the second half of the course focuses on how we would motivate others. And it also considers how others have tried to motivate us. And most of my lectures will be built around how to motivate children and teenagers. And I do this because I know you already have experience with coaching, tutoring, teaching, doing other kinds of things with children. My first 3 classes in this half of the course focus on what I think are the 3 main ways that adults try to motivate children. The first way is to use rewards. They come in many different forms. They could be tangible, they can be symbolic. And the second way is to use praise. And the third way, which I'll focus on today, is to introduce competitions, to get people to care about and actively involved in competing with other kids so that they could shine and they could show that they're better. Now, in the second half of the course, my focus is not so much on performance and reaching your goals necessarily. The focus instead is more on intrinsic motivation, and that refers to staying interested in the activity and continuing to do the activity because it's interesting in its own right. And I've highlighted the fact that the way we often motivate children is to introduce extrinsic incentives. And today I'll suggest that competition can be very similar to rewards in that it's highly enticing. Young people could get very involved in it, but it's essentially an extrinsic motivation. And the danger with extrinsic motivation is that even though it's a powerful motivator in the short term, in the long run, it can actually undermine the child's interest in the activity. So it can undermine intrinsic motivation. So today's class is how does competition impact intrinsic motivation? So the questions will be, what's the impact of competition on intrinsic motivation? And the other thing I'll consider, and this is something you've probably heard and you'll continue to hear, is that many coaches, many teachers will tell you that it's important to prepare children for competition. And it's important to do this because the real world is full of competition. And you have to be ready to jump in there and fight it out with everyone else. So I'll directly address that. Sometimes I show you a brief movie. It's actually a Tim Hortons advertisement. It's a charming videography about a little boy's first attempts to play hockey and his first little micro hockey team. And it's really sweet and endearing because you could see how excited and enthusiastic he is, and also how clumsy he is, but how he keeps trying, and his dad is working with him. And when you see this commercial, I think you're likely to think, boy, this is so great that kids in Canada get to learn how to skate and play hockey, and it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. And I'll come back to hockey players. I have some videos later on of outstanding peewee hockey players and junior hockey players. And I don't think Tim Horton could make a commercial out of the hockey players when they're 15, 16, 17 years old. So I'll get to that later. Now, I'll begin with some examples. And I'd like to draw a distinction between different ways of participating in a sport or participating in an activity. So many of us as children probably had activities where we got involved in an informal way with friends. So my brother, for example, he was 4 years older than me, and my parents were German-speaking immigrants, and my brother didn't really know how to speak English well until he was 8 or 9 years old. So he was a little slow to get acculturated, and his favorite sport, like mine, was basketball, but he never played organized basketball in a league. He would just play basketball up in the park on public basketball courts, and there'd be pickup basketball games, and he was quite a good player, and he loved basketball, but he did it informally. You'll see that I think this is significant because my brother, up until the age of 62, he continued to play basketball. Once or twice a week, he moved from city to city because of his job, but he always found a group of guys who would rent a grade school gym on the weekend, and they'd play basketball games, just pickup games. So his involvement in basketball was mostly informal. On the other hand, I'm 4 years younger than my brother, and I was speaking English by the time I was 4 or 5. And the sport that I liked most was also basketball. And I became involved in organized basketball at the age of probably 8 or 9. So like my brother, I would play up in the park. I would do it informally. But I also got involved in organized sports, where I was on a team, where we had practices, where we played in a league. And in high school, I played in 2 different leagues. And almost all of my activity was organized. The difference between my brother and I then is he exclusively did informal sports involvement, and I gradually shifted to almost all organized sports. Now, the other thing that happened with me was that I stopped playing basketball at the age of 18, never really played since, so my brother continued on for 44 years after I had stopped. And I know exactly when, where, and why I stopped playing basketball. And I view it as a case of having my intrinsic motivation destroyed. So I'll tell you that story. So here's a picture of me with the basketball team in my senior year of high school, 1976. I'm holding the ball because I'm the captain of the team. Now, I had told you that I peaked in basketball as a freshman. This is 3 years later. I did not get better. If anything, I actually got worse. The team got worse. Some of our best players had various problems. And in my senior year as the captain, I led the team to a record of 5 wins and 19 losses. So we had a winning percentage of 18%. As you know from your own exams, 18% is usually not a very good score. So for me, it was very discouraging to be the captain of a team and for the team to be so bad and for me to be so bad. So, I think I could have survived it and continued to like playing basketball. I probably could have survived it. Unfortunately, that year something happened, which ordinarily would be a wonderful thing, but every year in New York City, they have a lottery, and all the high schools' names are put in the lottery, and if you win the lottery, you get an opportunity to play one of your games at Madison Square Garden. Madison Square Garden is the professional basketball arena in New York City. It's considered the mecca of basketball. And the way it would work is that the two high schools that won the lottery, at 4 o'clock, they would play a game against each other. And then at 7 o'clock, the professional New York Knicks would play a game, and you would be invited to stay. The other thing that you could do is invite family and friends, and they could watch your game and then stay for the professional game too. So it would be a wonderful, wonderful thing, except I was the captain of a team, and I had a feeling our team wouldn't do too well. So the day comes, and they matched us against a team that was only a little better than us, All Hallows. This is the score here. You can see it's not a good score. This is my team. And they matched us against a team who ordinarily was just a little bit better than us. But something happened where the coach of the other team took the game seriously, so he scouted us. And the way our team was set up is we had one outstanding player. He was a junior. He went on to play at Princeton. And he could score 30, 35 points a game. What the other coach did was he decided to play a box and one, where basically two players were always covering our best player. And they were leaving one person alone. The person they were leaving alone was me. So they figured, okay, we're going to put two guys on their best player, and we're going to let this guy do whatever he wants. Our coach noticed that, and he said, Rich, you could get to the foul line and take a shot from there every play, and you shoot 60, 70% from the free throw line. This is how we're going to win the game. Ordinarily, I was a good shooter. I could shoot from the free throw lane, but I was playing in Madison Square Garden. My parents and brother and sister were watching. I'd never allowed them to watch a game of mine before. And I took like 12 shots in the first half, but my elbows were shaking and I couldn't see straight, and I only made one. So we were down by 20 points at halftime, mostly because I sucked. So at halftime, I went to the coach and I said, I just can't shoot today. You should let someone else shoot instead of me. And I thought he would say, that's really honest of you, Rich. I'm going to change our plans. But instead, he exploded. And he said, you're the captain of the team. I told you you're the one who has to shoot. You're going to stay in the game. You're going to keep shooting. And I don't want you to quit on us. This is disgraceful. He didn't say that, but that's the way I felt he was talking. So I said, okay, thanks for that vote of confidence. And then I went out and I missed 5 more shots in a row. The coach finally took me out of the game. I never got back in the game. And for the next 3 or 4 games, I didn't get to play at all. By the end of the year, I had a backup role. So we ended up losing by 35 points or something. And I felt humiliated, embarrassed. But mostly, I just wasn't interested in playing basketball anymore. And the problem was, it wasn't that I just didn't want to play organized basketball or I didn't want to play in Madison Square Garden. I just didn't want to be associated with that sport anymore. So I think what happened to me is there was something about organized sports that changed the way I approached the game, and there was something about my high school senior year experience that actually dropped a nuclear bomb on my intrinsic motivation, and I wasn't able to recover from that. Okay, so now I'm going to tell you about a model of sports commitment. It's by an outstanding sports psychologist at UCLA. Her name was Tara Scanlon. I think she's retired now. She focuses on sports commitment, which is not exactly the same as intrinsic motivation. So intrinsic motivation means doing something because of the interest and enjoyment that flows from the activity. And commitment means the desire and resolve to continue sports participation. But I think the two are related, and I think this model is useful for thinking about why some of us might have lost interest in a sport, a musical activity, a performing arts, or something else. So commitment is the desire and resolve to continue sports participation. She thinks if you want to predict whether a 6-year-old or an 8-year-old will remain committed throughout their childhood and into their adolescence, you have to look at 5 factors. Some of them are positive predictors, some of them are negative. So the first and most important factor is sports enjoyment. Scanlon would note there's individual differences. Some of us will like sports where you twirl and spin and jump. Some of us will like sports where you catch and shoot. Some of us will like individual sports. Some of us will like team sports. But there's an affective reaction that we have when we're first introduced to a sport and when we develop some skills at the sport, and there will be individual differences. I like basketball. Someone else might like soccer. Someone else might like performing arts more than sports. But she would say the most important predictor in the long term is this affective reaction to the activity. And I would say that pretty quickly I felt basketball was the thing I liked most. Now, the tricky thing is my brother had exactly the same feeling. So we both had a really strong, positive, affective reaction. And that should be a predictor of remaining committed for the long term. Second thing she says you have to consider is what are the opportunities of being involved in this sport? Particularly, what are the unique things you could get from doing this sport? So, many of us, when we do a sport, whether it be gymnastics, figure skating, basketball, you get a sense of competence and you get a sense of mastery. And sometimes you can get that more easily and more readily at sports than you can at school or in your social life or in other areas. So perhaps there's a unique opportunity to feel mastery and competence from our sports. Now, when I was a boy, I was kind of shy, or at least introverted and somewhat shy. And one of the things, if you're introverted and shy, one of the things you may have found is that it's easier for you when you do structured activities. So instead of just hanging out and talking or figuring out what to do, if you're playing a game or a sport, there are rules, there's structure, and I actually found it a really good setting in which to become friends with other boys. So I would say that basketball involvement provided me with a sense of mastery and competence and also social connection and camaraderie. So that's a positive predictor too. A third factor is in predicting commitment is to consider how much you've invested. And here, I wouldn't necessarily think this is a positive predictor. But if you spent a lot of time, money, energy, buying equipment, getting coaching, traveling, she would suggest that will increase your commitment. So if you and your family have really focused on a sport, gotten special coaching, gotten special equipment, Scanlon would say that would increase your level of commitment. So if your dad built a hockey rink in the backyard, if he played with you every night, you would be more likely to stay committed. Personally, I think that could backfire, but in her model, the personal investments that you've made into the sport should lead to higher commitment. So the first three are all positive. The unique opportunities, the affective reaction, and how much you've invested. The last two are negative factors. And the first one I'll tell you about is, besides considering what opportunities you have in the sport you're playing, you have to consider what are the alternatives that may appear for you. So when you go to high school, you may have liked basketball a great deal, but in high school there's a lot of new activities. You could join robotics, you could get involved in the theatrical group, you can do other kinds of things. And to the extent that those other things are very appealing to you, it's probably going to take away from your commitment to your sport. So I'll give you an example of this. In my senior year, when I was the captain, there was one fellow in my class, Neil Greeley, who had been on the team as a junior. And in our senior year, I would say he was about the seventh best player. He was very fit. He was a good defensive player, but he kind of had stone hands. He couldn't handle the ball very well. But he definitely would have been on the team, and he would have played, and we wanted him to be on the team, but he decided he was going to step away from basketball in his senior year, which, that's a legitimate decision, but we were curious, why are you stepping away? He had decided that he wanted to get involved in doing theater. So he tried out at the neighboring girls' school for a play called The Fantastics. It's an off-Broadway play. It's a musical comedy. He not only was accepted, he was going to be the star of the show. And he told us this, and we thought, are you serious? You're going to do musical comedy instead of playing basketball? And we just couldn't believe it. Now, if you're watching the show Sex Education, you may realize there's a parallel, because Jackson, who's the swimmer, actually joins a musical comedy about Shakespeare. It's a nice subplot. But in any case, we just thought, why would he do this? But it turns out he knew what he was doing. The play was a big success. He met a lot of girls. He was the only boy in my school who probably knew a girl. So he knew what he was doing. And our basketball team was really terrible, so he made the right choice. But the new opportunities that arise, and it could be an interest in the opposite sex, or an interest in the same sex, or an interest in romance, or an interest in social activities, or robotics, or something else, that can take away from your sports commitment. Finally, the last factor that Scanlon would say is really important to consider is the social constraints. And here, she thinks this is a negative factor. So that having over-involved parents who are pressuring you to continue with the sport, or having an over-involved coach or teammates who are saying, Neil, come on, play basketball. This is embarrassing, doing your theater stuff. But feeling constrained and compelled by other people to continue with the sport, Scanlon will say, will backfire. So I look at this list of things, the 5 factors: sports enjoyment, involvement, personal investments, and when I consider the case of my brother who maintained his commitment and myself who lost my commitment, I don't think we could be differentiated on any of these 5 factors. And I think Scanlon is missing the biggest thing that impacted me and the biggest thing that's likely to impact you. And that is competition and the effects of competition on our interest and liking and motivation for a sport. So I like the model. I think it's a great model. But what's missing is competition. Now, this particular model was developed from the relationships field. So close relationships, romantic relationships, they look at commitment, and this model is adapted from that. And in close relationships, I don't think it would make sense to think about, okay, how are you competing with your romantic partner? It actually is a factor, but I don't think most of us would think about it. But with sports, oh my gosh, in the United States, sports is where we all compete. And this is where our parents want us to be competing. So the missing factor, I would say, is competition. And I'm going to now shift a little bit and show you a video about the Royal Ballet School in Toronto, which I think is the best ballet academy in the country. And if you're a great ballet performer in the Maritimes or in Manitoba, you probably will move to Toronto if you can get into this school, because it's the very best training with the best teachers. And this particular clip is about competition. And you will hear the director of the program and the assistant director and many of the girls and one boy. And I just want to show you this, and then I'll get back to the question of the effects of competition on intrinsic motivation.
Most of them want to come and want to be chosen, so there's always that pressure of every day, well, I wonder. The fact that they're away from home, missing their parents in a lot of cases. We find that some of the children will say to us that they love being here, they want to be dancers, but they miss their family too. So it's a very big issue for children of such a young age. So they do have, they have quite a struggle.
Sure, I see it as a competition, but it's not always on my mind. Because even if you're full-time students, there's still always competitions to be like the soloist of the show and like the main dancer, and if you don't get it, you're like, oh, you got it. Sure, there's that, but when you really think about it, it's not so bad, because everybody has their moment in life. So if that wasn't your moment, you're gonna have yours maybe next year.
I just see it like I'm dancing with a bunch of girls, and I'm dancing with them, and they're like my friends. That's all. I don't compete against them. They might compete against me, but I really don't want to compete against them.
You grow really close to your friends, and the friends you do grow really close to, they understand if they don't get accepted and you get accepted. And this isn't the only school, but this is a good school.
The issue of competition fascinates me, and it fascinates me not only as director of the National Ballet School, as artistic director, but also as a woman and as a Canadian, because I think that we in Canada have to allow ourselves to say competition out loud, and again to say competition is a healthy thing. You have to develop the life skills to handle it, but we're kidding ourselves if we pretend that competition isn't a part of day-to-day life.
There's an awful lot there. Yes.
So the message from the director is, as a Canadian, as women, we might be somewhat averse to being openly competitive, but we have to change that. We have to learn that it's okay to compete. We have to develop the skills to do it. And this is what our everyday life is going to be about. There's actually been a number of students in this class over the years who were at this school. And when I watched it, I thought, I don't know why I do this, but I thought the director was maybe the harsh, controlling, difficult one. And I thought that the assistant seems like she's more empathic and understanding. And the students told me it's actually the opposite, that the director is a really nice, caring person, even though she comes out a little bit, her talking about the importance of competing. Yeah. Yeah, so, no, you're getting at, so the two things I think, the key points I want to make, and you'll read this in Ed DC, with rewards, with praise, with competition, the critical thing is, how does it make you feel in terms of competence? Do you feel more or less competent? And that's a positive thing if you feel competent. But also, how controlled do you feel? How much pressure do you feel to act, think, or perform at a certain level? And the control is the negative factor that undermines autonomy and that damages intrinsic motivation more than anything. So competition, the question will be, does being involved in competition enhance your competence, or is it making you feel controlled? And it can be doing both things, so you have to balance. Unfortunately, competition can also make you feel less competent and more controlled. That's the double whammy. And I'll show you that there's evidence that it's really all about gauging the effect of competition on your sense of competence and then on how controlled and pressured you feel. I will take issue with this idea that we need more experience with competition. I think we get lots of experience competing at school and in all kinds of activities. I think what we're lacking quite often is learning how to cooperate and collaborate and work effectively with others. So I'm not sure that I buy the message, but it's a very common message. And coaches, music teachers, they'll always be telling you things like this. Okay. Ed DC was very suspicious of competition. His hypothesis was that it's just like an extrinsic reward. People like it, they'll get excited about winning it, they'll fight for it, they'll be invested in it, but this will represent extrinsic motivation. And that later on, when there's no competition, people won't want to do the activity. Their doing the activity will be contingent on whether they can compete at it. So he designed a study in 1981 using the free choice paradigm. It was really a well-conceptualized study. It was done with engineering students. The particular task was what's called a soma puzzle. It's also called happy cubes. And it involves having like 6 cubes that are differently shaped. And you're given a design that you're asked to make with these cubes. And they can be more or less difficult, but it involves visual spatial reasoning and planning. And it's the kind of thing engineers love. So the way he set up this study was people would first have a practice puzzle to get familiar with it. And it was always set up so that there were 2 participants at the same time. But there were 2 different conditions. In one condition, the 2 participants were next to each other at a table, but they were told that they should each work on their own thing. It was kind of like a parallel play. In the other condition, they were told that they were supposed to compete against the other person. So the instructions in the competitive condition were try to beat the other person, and in the parallel play condition, it was do your best. Now, there was something sneaky about this study. The other participant who would come to the experiment with you, who would look like an ordinary university student, was in fact a Confederate. It was someone who was working with the experimenter, the researcher, and was only posing as a participant. And this confederate was taught and instructed in making sure that they always allowed the real participant to win and to finish first. So they would like mess around until the participant finished, and then they would finish. So this was set up so it was competition versus no competition, but you'd always be getting feedback that you actually were faster. Even in the parallel play, they made sure that the confederate only completed it after you had finished. So they also reminded people after the first puzzle that they should try to beat the other person, or you should do your best. What DC found is that when the participants, the next part of the experiment after they competed, or after they did the parallel play, the experimenter came and said, okay, now I have to interview each of you, and let me just randomly pick a name here, and I'll start with that person. But they always picked the name of the confederate. So the confederate would get up, and they'd be walking out of the room, and the experimenter would say, well, it's going to be about 5 minutes, and there's some magazines here, there's some leftover puzzles. You could do whatever you like, or you could just sit, but I'll be back in 5 minutes. The participant who was left alone was secretly observed to see whether they continued playing with these puzzles. That represented the free choice measure of intrinsic motivation. And what Ed DC found was that the competition acted just like an extrinsic reward. So the participants who were competing showed dramatically less intrinsic motivation during a free choice period than the participants who were not competing. So the impact of getting involved with these puzzles in order to beat someone was very different than getting involved in these puzzles just trying to do your best. And this was true even though you won. You'd have to guess that if you competed and you lost, maybe the damage would have even been greater. So Ed DC for a number of years argued that competition is like tangible rewards. It's an extrinsic motivator that will undermine a university student's or a child's intrinsic motivation. Now, other motivation researchers would say that Ed DC was missing something. In fact, Csikszentmihalyi did a study with high school basketball players. And he asked basketball players, what's your reason for enjoying basketball? And he gave people a list of 15 things, and here are the top 8 that basketball players in high school would list. And their number one reason for enjoying basketball, and enjoyment is about intrinsic motivation, was competition. But it was competition in a different way than many of us might think about it. It's competition in terms of measuring yourself against others, and competition in terms of finding challenge. So Csikszentmihalyi, who's always interested in the match of skill and challenge, would say that one thing that all of us can always do when an activity becomes routine and boring is we could add competition. So if you like jogging, and if you're running half hour a day, 3 days a week, and if you've been doing it for a year, Csikszentmihalyi would say you should think about doing a 5K race. See how you do, how fast you can go, where you would place, and then try to go even faster, and then try a 10K race, and then try a half marathon, and you're always looking for more challenge. So Csikszentmihalyi would say that DC doesn't understand that competition can actually be about challenge and measuring yourself. And eventually, at DC had a postdoctoral fellow named John Marshall Reeve who knew about Csikszentmihalyi's work, and he said, you know, Ed, we should really test whether competition can sometimes have a positive effect, sometimes have a negative effect, depending on whether it's focused on challenge versus whether it's focusing on beating the other people. So Ed DC repeated the study he had done earlier, but he had two different kinds of competition condition. In fact, there were 5 conditions in this study. I'm going to focus on the 3 most interesting and the 3 most theoretically relevant. So the basic idea was they were going to use the free choice paradigm to see whether competition can sometimes decrease and sometimes increase. And the 3 conditions will all include competition, the ones I'm telling you about, but they're going to vary in one condition. What they distinguish is whether the competition was controlling, which focused on beating others, versus whether it was non-controlling. So the 2 central conditions were non-controlling competition, where you were told, try to outperform the other person by solving the puzzles faster. And there were 3 puzzles. It involved the Confederate. The Confederate, in one situation, the Confederate would always lose to you. In the other situation, the Confederate beat you 2 out of 3 times. So this first condition, the non-controlling competition, they actually split it so that sometimes you won, sometimes you lost. So non-controlling competition, just try to outperform the other person by solving the puzzles faster. Then there was also a controlling competition condition where they ramped up the amount of pressure you would feel. In this condition, they said, it doesn't matter how fast or slow you solve each puzzle or whether you figure out how the puzzle works. The only thing that matters is that you win. It's just about winning. You have to win. So focus all your attention on being the winner. And then they were reminded, either solve your puzzles faster in the non-controlling condition or focus on being the winner. Win at all costs. I'll show you the results and you'll see the design more clearly here. It's a little bit strange because instead of being a 2x2, it's 2 conditions in the non-controlling, win, lose, but then only win with the, and I'll explain why they had to do it that way. Okay, so here are the results. These first 2 columns, that's the non-controlling condition where you either win or you lose. And this is the controlling condition where there was there was only winning. There were 3 dependent variables. The first is free choice time spent on the activity when you were left alone and you could do other things. This is the number of seconds. And then there was a reported feelings of competence and control. And what you can see is that one condition stands out. The condition where there were high levels of intrinsic motivation was when it was non-controlling, where you were told to go faster, but there wasn't an obsessive focus on winning at all costs. And then you actually won. So that's 144 seconds. That's 3 or 4 times as much as if you had controlling instructions and you won. But notice too that if you were in a non-controlling condition, but you lost, it was arranged and rigged so that you lost, you had very low levels of intrinsic motivation. So there's two ways that I could hurt your intrinsic motivation. One is by setting it up so that you'll lose. One is by setting it up so that you'll win, but I'll get you so focused on beating the other person that you'll feel coerced and compelled. So the damaging condition was, the only condition that was positive was non-controlling with the win. The other two measures are reports of how competent and controlled you feel, and these were thought to be mediators. And what you can see is when you lose, competence is very low, 3.7 this should be, and that actually, competence, notice how low competence is, 4.1 versus 5.5 versus 5.6. So the reason people in the lose condition have low intrinsic motivation is because they feel incompetent. In terms of how controlled people feel, it's when you're in the controlled condition and you win that the intrinsic motivation is very low. So the key in these results is that you have to consider both whether you win or lose and whether it's non-controlling or controlling. Let's see. Now, there's one condition that's missing here. You probably would have wondered about this. The condition that you might want to add to this, but it wasn't included, was a controlling and lose. So there's a condition you would probably want to see, which is it's really important to win. You have to do your best. You have to beat the other person. But then it's set up so that you actually lose. These researchers could not do that condition because the ethics board would not allow them to set you up to really care about winning and then tell you that you failed to do so. So the concern would be that to heighten people's investment in the competition and then set it up so that they will lose will make people really upset, sad, and disheartened. And so in that study, they weren't able to include that condition. So they protected participants from a condition which highlighted competition and where they were led to lose. What I'd like to point out, though, is that in most of our lives, we are not protected from the condition where we are competing and we feel controlled and we end up losing. So, okay. Now, my guess is that when I was at Madison Square Garden, I was actually in the lose and be controlled condition. I had the double whammy of really caring about winning and leading our team to a good season and a good performance, but I lost. So I felt responsible for the loss, and I felt incompetent, and I felt controlled. So I think that my intrinsic motivation was damaged by the way I had been involved in competition. And when I go back to looking at my brother's experience versus my own, there are some people who've suggested that informal sports settings provide a better balance between challenge and abilities, and that actually we're more likely to enjoy ourselves. So playing at Madison Square Garden, I was terrible. I felt terrible about my performance. And if I had not been in an organized sports setting, if I was just playing up the park with my brother and our friends, what would happen if I was playing poorly, in an informal setting, you would just play till 11 points, and then you'd say, let's switch the sides around. So if it was an informal game with the team we were playing against, most likely, there would have been some discussion about how to make it a better game. And that would involve putting Richie on the other team and taking a good player from the other team and putting it on this team. Because when you're playing informally, you want everyone to have a good experience. And you set things up so that things are balanced and even. But in organized sports, they don't do that. So, from Reeve and Deasy's study, it does seem like you can do competition in a way that won't undermine intrinsic motivation. The way to do that is to take the focus off beating the other person and instead talk about competition as something that's challenging and allows you to test your skills. But even though you can do that, the authors believe it's unlikely. Instead, they say the results suggest that winning a competition may not undermine intrinsic motivation if there isn't undue pressure. Unfortunately, it seems that the unyielding focus on winning in our society may be creating a pressuring context that can have quite negative effects on individuals' experience and motivation. So theoretically, in a laboratory, you can design a condition which focuses on competition but doesn't undermine intrinsic motivation. These authors would say that in the real world, with real parents, real coaches, it's very hard to imagine you'll get a condition where it's purely about the challenge and where there's not a focus on a pressuring form of competition. I have a really good example of this. So one of my colleagues, Jillian O'Driscoll, she's been in the department for 25 years. She's an expert on schizophrenia. She's a neuroscientist. When she did her PhD at Harvard, in her spare time, she was the assistant coach on a girls' soccer team. They were 8-year-old girls. She had played soccer in high school and university, and she wanted to do something fun, so she was a coach. She was very happy about the experience because she was the assistant coach, and the head coach was a really nice, caring man who wasn't over the top in terms of his competitive drive. Her team was called the Chipmunks, and for the 8-year-olds, they had a rule that all the girls on the team had to play at least one half. If you remember being on sports teams when you were in grade school, one of the things that happens is that sometimes you don't get to play because you're not one of the good players. And then you feel bad because you don't even get in the game. In this league, they required all of the 15 players to play at least one half of the soccer game. And Jillian said that her coach, the head coach, actually followed that rule. Most of the other coaches cheated and tried to make sure their best players were out there more. But she said her coach had a growth mindset, and he wanted all the players to develop their skills and get better, and that actually the kids really did improve. And the team also did well, and they made it to the playoffs. They won their first playoff game, and then they were going to go to the championship game. And the league made a decision that she couldn't understand. They decided they were going to throw out that rule about how everyone has to play one half, and that for the championship game, the coaches could play their best players if they wanted to. They wanted to really see who was the best team. So what happened was that in the first half, the game was tied 1-1, and 2 two of the girls who would usually come in at halftime came up to the coach and said, you know, we're ready to go in, we've warmed up. And the coach said, you're not going in today. The rules have changed, and we're going to be trying to win this game with our best players. The two girls immediately, they're 8-year-olds, they immediately started crying. And they continued to cry throughout the second half. So in the second half, in the last couple of minutes, the Chipmunks scored a goal. They won the game. All the girls ran out and jumped on each other, except for the two girls who never got to play. They were still on the sidelines crying. Jillian said she rode home in the car with one of the two girls and the coach, and the girl was still crying. And what made this story really difficult is that that girl was the coach's daughter. So, you know, in one sense, there's like incredible moral conviction to sit your own daughter in the championship game, even though she's going to be crying. But on the other hand, here you have a really nice man who's a good coach, who has a growth mindset. But when the rules change slightly and the focus is on winning, he did something that was probably very hurtful to his daughter. I'm guessing she is no longer playing soccer, that her interest in the sport was destroyed. And I think what Ryan and what Reeve and DC say here is true. It's so pervasive, the focus on winning, especially the championship game, that even people who ordinarily would be very different can get caught up in that. Okay, another problem with a focus on winning, focus on competition, not only will it undermine our intrinsic motivation, either because we lose or because we feel controlled, it also changes the way we play. There's a very strong link between focusing on competition and displaying poor sportsmanship. So there's a lot of problems with youth hockey around the lack of sportsmanship and the disrespect to coaches and to other players. So that there's been some research on what happens to intrinsic motivation because of competition and what happens to sportsmanships. And I'll show you a couple videos with some elite.
Basically, then there's something going on.
Roger Prue, a ref in the Metropolitan Toronto League, has been physically attacked by players and by fans. It's one thing to hear about how refs are now treated, but to be part of Roger's world, we wanted to live it with him. To see and hear what he sees and hears, we wired him up with a miniature camera and microphone. We wanted to get a feel for what it's like to be where both the pucks and the language are fast and furious. In this league, 8 to 18-year-olds play in the most competitive amateur hockey in the country. Most of the time, most games are rough and physical, in other words, normal. It's what comes with hockey.
Out, 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 out. That's it. That's it.
But occasionally, a spark ignites some hidden fury, and increasingly, refs are becoming the targets of rage from players and even fans.
Nothing else, I said. Let's go. 7.
What used to be occasional is now no longer a rarity. What's alarming sports lovers as opposed to sports fans is what you're about to see.
60, sit down.
Keep your eye on number 16.
You see your fucking face, asshole. Okay, plus 10 more. Fucking asshole. Good night. Thank you. You're welcome.
Violence and swearing can no longer be written off as simply part of the game. More and more, hockey officials will tell you, it's a warning of worse to come.
So that looks pretty bad, but it can even get worse. You're not going to believe this next example, and you won't believe that the father and son agreed to be interviewed for a national broadcast about their behavior.
Nowadays, that's kind of fade out. There is no respect anymore out there for officials. We're just someone who's out there, and people think that they can just treat you the way they want.
For some referees, it simply seemed too much. Sam Mara dropped out of competitive games altogether. He now referees only seniors games just for the fun of it. Mara quit after being threatened by the parent of a player he'd penalized.
As the game's going on, all of a sudden I hear a voice from the stands. His father just yelling at me. For what reason, I have no idea. Later I find out he says I swore at his son. All game, he's just riding my butt. I finally, at the end of the game, when we're getting off, him and his son are sitting at the stand and say, you know, Mara, we know where you live. We're going to come and get you. And right at that point, I lost my composure and cool. And then I started saying things I probably shouldn't have said. And I just said, enough of this shit. I don't need this anymore. I don't need some parent screaming and yelling at me. I could have been home with my kids and wife there. And, you know, instead of being at an arena and making $12, like.
That parent was Barry Grove. The player, his 16-year-old son, Matthew. So extreme was the shouting match with Mara last January, Matthew was given an 8-game suspension.
I said, well, if you don't mind, I'd like to just talk to the ref. It's not a rude question or anything. And he says, then he tells me to F off, just like that.
You're 16 years old and you're in the middle of a hockey game. Did you actually say, if you don't mind, I would like to, or were you a little bit more excited?
Yeah, that's exactly what I said, surprisingly.
So you're the father, your son's been thrown out of the game. What did you and other parents yell at the referee?
I can't recall exactly everything that was being said. I know what I said.
What did you say?
I kept saying to this guy, I knew where he lived. I told him he stunk as an unofficial. Probably said a few other things I can't remember now.
But to say to a guy under those circumstances, I know where you live, there's a menacing note to that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And sitting up in the stands feeling that he's been unjustly accused of something, and as a father, as a parent, you know, you're trying to fight back without letting it get out of hand. It did get out of hand. There's no doubt about it.
But do you regret having said it, or do you just regret that it sort of ended up being a media incident? Do you feel badly that you said it, I guess, is what I'm asking?
I shouldn't have threatened him in that way. I can see that he would see it. I would certainly see it as a threat if somebody said that to me, whether I'm in a parking lot or wherever. I would see that as a threat.
Okay, so the poor kid, you could understand why his dad might have threatened the person's life. I mean, after all, it is a competitive situation. So that seems extreme, but I would just note that those kind of incidents aren't that rare. And there was some work done by Robert Vallerand at the University of Quebec at Montreal, and it was with Pee-wee hockey players, and it was a longitudinal study. And they measured intrinsic motivation, they measured how much you care about competition, and they measured sportsmanship. So, let's see. This first is an example of a description of someone who's playing the game for the trophies, medals, and winning, and who is willing to do everything they can to get an advantage on the opponent. And it's mostly capturing the extent to which you would say, yes, when you're competing, anything goes. And then they also contrasted this with measuring whether people are doing it mostly for the interest and the personal excellence and things of that sort. And then they measured, these were midget elite AAA hockey players, they measured sportsmanship. And what they found was that over the course of the year, all of the players shifted dramatically from caring more about enjoyment and personal challenge to caring more about competition and winning and beating the other team. And that as that emphasis on competition increased, the sportsmanship decreased dramatically. and that this was a mediational relationship. So besides possibly losing intrinsic motivation, there's also a marked increase in a lack of sportsmanship. So what happens with youth hockey, what happens with youth basketball, what happens with youth baseball, at the age of 5 or 6, you have thousands of kids who get introduced to the sport, they're interested in the sport, and it's the organized sport systems are organized like funnels, so that they start off with an incredible number of kids. There's not too much focus on who are the best, who's not the best. But each year, the criteria for making a team gets more and more difficult. So almost all of us at some point get the message that we're not good enough to go to the next level. So a lot of us will lose our intrinsic motivation because we get an incompetence message. We get the feedback that we're not good enough to keep playing soccer as a 15-year-old. And 90% of the kids who started at age 5 are no longer playing at the age of 12. They're not playing organized sports, but the sad thing is they're not playing informally out of fun and interest. They just are not involved in the sport anymore. Now, there are some who are good enough to keep going to the next level, next level, and there's one who might make it out at the end, out of the first 100 from NDG, let's say. The danger is, though, that this is a highly skilled but also really competitive player who will have very poor sportsmanship, and there are certain, implicit rules about playing hockey that if you step back, you might say that doesn't make any sense. So my understanding as a hockey fan is that one of the things you do is if you're playing against someone who has an injury, you target them and you target that injury. So the Montreal Canadiens played the Ottawa Senators on Saturday. They are both terrible teams. You would think they wouldn't care about competition, but it turns out that Thomas Chabot, the best defenseman on Ottawa, had some kind of injury, and the Canadiens targeted that, and they knocked him out of the game in the first period. And that's what you do in hockey. That is the culture. There's no sportsmanship about it. It's like you find a weakness, you attack it, you hurt them. So we start out with all of these 6-year-olds who love hockey, love basketball, love football, and almost all of them get the message that they're incompetent and not good enough. A few can stay in it, but the ones who stay in it are exposed to an ultra-competitive culture. Someone has a question back there? Sure. So there's a fellow named Terry Orlick, who's a sports psychologist who's written a number of books for athletes, for parents, for coaches, to try to change the way these things are organized. There are motivational psychologists in California, for example. Mark Lepper tried to start a organized sports league, which wouldn't focus on competition and rewards. I actually think that the problem with what you're saying is that our best chance of having positive experiences is when they're not organized. So that I think the danger for many of us is, instead of playing pickup basketball or pickup soccer, getting into the organized sports. And I really do believe that my brother stayed interested in basketball for 50 years because he never got caught up in the craziness of organized sports. Now, what coaches will tell you, what the ballet the director of the ballet will tell you is that, yeah, you might not like what's happening with the competition, but it's still valuable and it represents what we need in the real world. And there's some things I would say about that, which is, the question is it really critical to teach these competitive skills? And I would first point out that if you think about the areas or the roles that are most important to you, and if you ask yourself, how useful is it for me to be competitive, to try to win all the time? And I think most of us, like my key roles are as a friend, as a husband, and as a parent. And in all of those roles, I don't think being competitive is helpful at all. You probably have some friends where there's a competitive dynamic and you're always, at some level competing with who's better. And that actually damages the friendship. Even in a romantic relationship, sometimes couples get involved in, like, who's better. And parents, I'll show you later on, there's a real serious problem with parents competing through their kids. And it's not good for the kids, it's not good for the parents. So I think one thing I would say is that, in fact, in many of our roles, competition is really unhelpful. Now, the one role you might think it's helpful is, well, maybe as a student or as a researcher or as a worker. And I just want to tell you that, in fact, you'll be really surprised that most organizations, most research labs, what they're looking for is people who can collaborate, people who can cooperate, people who can support other people in the group. Something that is really unwelcome is an incredibly incisive and competitive person who's going to shoot down every idea that the other people suggest. It's wrong to think that, intense competition will be rewarded, because it has motivationally negative effects. There was a recent, actually this a few years ago, they did an analysis of what kind of jobs will be available in the 21st century. Where are the jobs growing and what kind of skills you need? And what they find is, in fact, the jobs that are growing the most are the ones that require social skills. And what they mean by social skills are empathy, collaborative abilities, understanding of others, being able to work with others. And there's a lot of jobs that are growing in that area. The other key ability, you know this already, is kind of math skills or systematic, logical skills. They are not growing as much, but what you need most are the combination of the math skills plus the social skills. So you don't need engineers who are great at working alone. You need engineers who are great at working on teams. And that is where a lot of companies are focusing their attention. This combination of high social skills plus high systematizing skills. Let's see. So the jobs that require both socializing and thinking have fared best in employment and play. It includes doctors and engineers. And the feeling is that parents and educators should focus more on developing this combination of skills. And so that group activities like sports, band, or drama, or robotics, where you have a group of people and that they're taught to collaborate and cooperate and bring out the best in each other, that's really useful and really helpful. Okay, so what's the impact of competition on intrinsic motivation? On average, my guess is that competition has been a negative factor for intrinsic motivation. And it can also lead to poor sportsmanship and other kinds of problems. Theoretically and in the lab, you can design things where the competition focuses on challenge and personal mastery. I actually would challenge this notion that we have to prepare children to learn how to compete, because you are all high-achieving young adults, and my guess is you've been competing intensely from grade 2 onward. You're very skilled at it. You sometimes get frustrated by it, but we get lots of practice competing. Unfortunately, we get less practice collaborating and cooperating, and the biggest danger of all of this competition is that it goes with the rewards and it undermines our capacity to be intrinsically motivated about things. I have a nice follow-up class to this, which we'll do after the midterm exam, and it's a focus on the school system in Finland and what they focus on. They're non-competitive, they're cooperative. They focus on intrinsic motivation, not extrinsic motivation. So I'll review this and follow this up some in the class after the exam.